As an American, it's always fun to see how the other side lives. Hey, this episode of Some Gadget Guy is brought to you by viewers like you, all of the incredible people sharing content across social media, and the amazing generosity of my patrons at patreon.com/somegadgetguy. More info on these awesome nerds later in the video. I recently got back from a trip to India to cover the launch of MediaTek's newest phone chips. MediaTek supplied a phone for me to test drive, and here it is, the Oppo Find X8 Pro, rocking the new Dimensity 9400 SoC, and I think it's a champ. Now, I'm really familiar with OnePlus here in the United States. I spent most of my last year with my personal SIM in the OnePlus 12. It's one of the only times I can remember where I opted for an OP over another brand like Sony or a Pixel. I have not lived with an Oppo now for a while. The last longer term experience I had was the Find X3, which is a pretty sizable jump to today. Front of mind for me, the X8 Pro is really familiar now. I like the overall approach to streamlining development and merging a lot of the core experience between OnePlus and Oppo. I pick this phone up and I can immediately imagine what a OnePlus 13 Pro might feel like were we to ever get a phone like that here. I really like what Oppo is doing here in hardware. It's a unique look and feel in a market that is leaning into copying Apple more aggressively every generation. I personally prefer flat sides and a flat screen, but that doesn't mean we need to make a phone feel exactly like an iPhone. The casing here, the sides are flat, but they have a gentle curve to the metal frame, a very slight rounding and softer edges where pieces meet at seams. I know I'm splitting hairs. It's very subtle, but it still manages to feel a little different. Ditto the rear, a frosted satiny texture with a unique marble-like gradient. No two phones are exactly alike. And when combined with the circular camera housing, which is properly centered on the back of the phone, it helps a device like this stand out, as I've already been asked about it here in the States. It cannot be confused for an iPhone, Pixel, or Samsung. Continuing the hardware tour, I love that Oppo is adding a capacitive camera button, but they did not get rid of the 3-stage notification rocker. We still can toggle alerts or silence our phone, mute notifications, and we have a touch strip on the opposite side to launch the camera and take photos. And for that little touch strip here across the rest of the phone, the haptics are great. Like OnePlus, the new settings do a great job of mimicking actual hardware switches and dials and buttons. Again, a camera shutter should feel like a button. The display is vibrant and colorful, and I don't really do granular display tech investigations. I think in this premium tier, we're doing really well. It looks great while you're streaming content. It's very easy to read outdoors. I feel this is an appropriate generational improvement, and especially over my OnePlus, where this can peak brighter, and it seems to sustain that brightness just a little longer, which again, I have high hopes the OnePlus 13 will follow in this phone's footsteps. What's interesting are all the various permutations of Oppo and Vivo phones due out over the next year, and how the Oppo Pro here seems to be using an optical fingerprint sensor. It's still snappy, it's quick. I don't feel there's a noticeable penalty here over using a newer ultrasonic like in the Pixel 9 Pro, but I know ultrasonic sensors have their fans. I hope this means that the Oppo might be more tolerant to using different screen protectors, but I'm also sure that doesn't contribute much to a purchasing recommendation. I like it, it's good, it seems to keep the phone secure, which does bring us to performance. I think MediaTek has a tough chip to beat this year. They took a big gamble last year with an all-big core CPU design, and this is a refining year for that strategy, while Qualcomm is just now making their transition to all-big core this year. The performance on tap is incredible and directly paces laptops in a number of comparable tasks. We're not talking about lame Geekbench scores. These numbers, Geekbench and AnTuTu, they tell you very little about what kind of output you'll get from real-world apps, what you'll really do on the phone. I run a series of tests on things like file compression, batch photo processing, audio mixing, and video rendering. I have the full results of my tests available on my Patreon. That's patreon.com/somegadgetguy, but I'll leave you with a little tease right here. Let's queue up a 1-minute 4K video project with 6 clips shot from a mirrorless camera, transitions, a watermark, and a soundtrack. Now let's render this back down into another 4K video file at a reasonable bitrate for sharing on social media and time this against the Pixel 9 Pro. The prices are gonna be close, but the performance is not close. And don't worry, I'll do this again when the embargoes lift on global Snapdragon phones. I wonder if we could predict what chip might win that race between Qualcomm and MediaTek this year. It's a mystery. When we run this as hard as we can in the high performance mode, we can absolutely create scenarios where this chip will run hot and throttle. And I detail that granularly on the Patreon, but the amount of work you can accomplish before the chip starts to slow down is nothing short of stunning. No Geekbench or Antutu number can demonstrate what the practical advantage of this architecture can really accomplish. The fact that we're still leaning on those tests is just a lazy reviewer crutch, so they don't have to do actual legwork. Because let me tell you, it takes a long time to do actual real app performance testing. Ditto your gaming performance, where this phone strikes a handy balance of consistent frame rates over letting the phone scale up and throttle and ramp and throttle. A little like OnePlus, it's still a bit more managed than what you might find on a Sony or on a Xiaomi, but we have more options here to control that experience than on a Samsung, as an example. I don't test on the most popular games. I genuinely do not enjoy playing competitive shooters or Genshin Impact, which is terribly optimized for Android. I'm always on the lookout for other graphics-intense titles that might really tax a phone. I run a test with Wilderless as a fantasy walking demo because it has granular graphics options you can adjust. But at full resolution, with ultra settings on, the phone really doesn't have any issues hanging near 60 frames per second at placebo quality graphics. The only thing that makes sense in my brain, I really think we need to play with more PC game emulation, but I don't feel that's quite at a place yet where we'd have fair comparisons between Qualcomm and MediaTek, especially for support, developers, and optimization. That's where we are now, that's where we're headed. If you really want to know what your pocket computer is capable of, we gotta go to games that are gonna start stressing business-grade laptops. This chip is already capable of significantly outperforming a Nintendo Switch, is likely delivering a better performance per watt than an AMD APU in a gaming handheld console. There is not anything published as a direct mobile Android game that's gonna make this thing struggle. Developers could be bringing much bigger games to mobile. So where we'll definitely see a Qualcomm outperform this, that will likely be more a function of optimization than outright hardware advantages. That's totally my guess, of course. I couldn't possibly know how the Snapdragon 8 Elite performs yet, because phones are still under embargo. No. And that brings us to the battery life. One of the concerns that I had, I really haven't used this long enough to have good lifestyle data on battery life. And I keep accidentally leaving it in the high performance mode, so I've definitely been skewing my data so far. But in using it internationally, the phone is reassuringly long-lived. I was really worried that the bigger batteries this generation were going to be necessary to offset less efficient processors. Both the Dimensity and the new Snapdragon, when used as phones, are phenomenally well behaved. Where I was able to eke out roughly 2 days of use on phones from last year, I feel confident, even in my early use, that we should be able to push these phones a little farther still. My hypothesis is that the bigger battery might be more necessary when these phones are pulling more power, when that chip is being driven harder near its maximum performance. But the daily communication and social media needs should sip a lot less juice for these new CPU core configurations and the newer process, the smaller process from TSMC. And one of my favorite features from OnePlus, the Find X, supports real, actual fast charging, not fake North America fast charging. So even though the battery is significantly larger, depending on region, you will get an 80-watt charger in the box. The battery is bigger, and it still charges significantly faster than Apple and Samsung and Google. Real fast charging fundamentally changes your relationship with the phone, and it's the best way to curb battery anxiety. I'm not managing this phone, constantly looking for slow charging wireless pads or constantly plugging it in when I'm not using it. I just use the phone until I need to charge it, and then about 10 or 15 minutes plugged in gives me over a day of my kind of use. Moving on, I'll be producing a full camera review on this Oppo, and those camera deep dives are Patreon exclusives, but sharing some early thoughts. Oppo is finding a fun balance between point and shoot pixel style performance with a few more options to control the output for those nerds who like to compose their shot. I still don't think Oppo lands in the same territory as Sony, a Huawei, or a Xiaomi for those photo nerds that really like to dig in, but it doesn't feel like features are just omitted. It feels like this is by design what Oppo is trying to accomplish. The Find X8 Pro, like the OnePlus 12, is a fun camera to shoot on. Quad sensor setup on the back is beautifully complete with great focal lengths for landscape, street photography, candids, portraiture, and macro shooting situations. I love the quick toggles to slide exposure and activate your action modes immediately accessible in the main auto mode view, because I often don't like the full HDR processing effect, and when I'm shooting action, like my daughter running around a softball field, I don't want the phone shooting slower to make prettier colors. I want to freeze that movement. Great support for 4K 60 video with the ability to switch lenses while filming a clip, though I still think most cameras these days are too aggressive in switching lenses for you based on light and proximity. This Oppo is not as bad as my Vivo X100 Pro, but I also don't have a proper manual video mode to do a fair oranges to oranges comparison. For something like that, I might start leaning harder on the Blackmagic camera app, which just recently got proper support for this phone. The Hasselblad collaboration with Oppo and OnePlus has been so good for this camera stack. We've seen significant improvements to that point and shoot experience. The quality of the photos has improved, but things like the film mode, that's just not the same as having a good, dedicated manual mode for video. Maybe the best compliment I can pay this phone camera, with only a handful of exceptions. I took that recent trip to India, and visiting landmarks, bucket list experiences for me, like the Taj Mahal, I reached for the Find X more frequently than I reached for my Vivo X100 Pro, probably my favorite camera phone of last year. So, we're gonna start wrapping this review up, but spending a little time on software, and as I mentioned earlier, it's super familiar for how much I've been using the OnePlus 12. I like the direction ColorOS is headed, even for a few of those gripes about how iPhone-y some of the menus and animations might be. We've lost that purity of the Android experience, which no phone manufacturer, maybe Sony, kinda Motorola, is really putting out a stock Android kind of experience. I kind of moved on from old Oxygen OS, and I'm not really bothered by new Oxygen OS because I've just never really been the aesthetic guy. I don't care much at all about wallpaper packs and fancy animated widgets. I really liked LG phones back in the day, and those were usually UI design nightmares. What I care about is software that enables better productivity and cleaner interactions with more advanced features. When I want to turn an app into a little floating window, I think Oppo landed the best natural gesture to accomplish that. When I want access to things like split screening two apps side by side, I think Oppo arrived at clearer conveyance for where menus and options live. Of course, the big talking point this year is the AI. There are some really cool little features on the Find X that help it catch up to things we've been doing on Galaxies and Pixels. Improved photo tools, sharpening, and clarity, a really great way to reduce glare from glass and reflections, magic eraser style solutions. Also, in the audio recording app, transcribing and summarizing longer recordings. These are becoming table stakes for an AI future. The issue I have, most of these still require a network connection. So I have this insanely powerful pocket computer, but it's still tremendously difficult to demonstrate what performance advantage you would get by buying a premium expensive device if you care about the AI. If a summary to an audio recording requires processing up in the cloud, well, that could be accomplished by a much less expensive device in largely the same way. And that's where we are going to bring this plane in for a landing. The Find X8 Pro is a monster of a device, and it's encouraging to see internationally how rich the competition is. It's gonna be expensive in the markets it launches in, but it's also not the ultra tier device, and handily stands next to the main popularity players like Apple and Samsung. I think there's still this reviewer tendency to compare this based on the label on the box instead of the actual tech inside. Especially from more Western reviewers, we're going to define all of these conversations by Apple, Samsung, and Google, probably in that order of SEO tastiness. You're going to get to the end of all these videos with the real good hot take, but I don't know guys, what do you think about the Oppo Find X8 Pro? You gotta love the really lazy engagement bait question at the end of the video that has nothing to do with someone sharing their earnest opinions about a product. I showed you a Geekbench score. What more could you possibly want? But generally, I bet we're gonna be in Pixel 9 Pro XL pricing, somewhere around that ballpark in most regions. And if you took the labels off these products and just compared based on performance and features, you would need to get granularly specific why someone might opt for a Pixel, Galaxy, or iPhone over what Oppo has to offer. Now, I know specs don't sell the phone, but it's getting harder and harder to ignore how ruthlessly competitive devices like this have become. And I think in the premium space right now, Oppo is making a better overall argument for a premium device than the manufacturers we get to play with here in the United States. And we're just getting started. It's still 2024. Wild to think other manufacturers are right around the corner with other global launches. This is giving me high hopes for the next OnePlus. I'm looking at Vivos and iQOOs that will both arrive before Samsung gets new Galaxies out the door. We've hit yet another tier of pocket computer performance, and tech reviewers are still pretending that the best way to talk about these products is, the average consumers. What will basic people do with $1,000 phones? And average is a massive population of phone consumers that do not watch tech review videos. So here's my lazy engagement bait question. I need good suggestions from you out there in the audience. You're spending over $1,000 on a phone. We have to expect these phones can do more. I've been on this drum beat for years, and it still doesn't seem to crack through the tech enthusiast landscape, let alone trickle its way into a broader consumer base. So what do we need to do? What else should I be doing to test these things and properly assess the value of a phone over $1,000? Please deliver me the tastiest of hot takes down in the comments below. I love digging into a new phone, a new generation of chips, looking at that performance. Just to reiterate, the folks who are going to get to see the actual bar graph results of all of my testing first are my amazing patrons, all of the folks over on patreon.com/somegadgetguy. A huge thank you from the bottom of my heart, as this list of people, they are directly responsible for helping to keep the lights on here in the Gadget Lab. These videos and reviews and editorials would not be possible without their support. They're basically the coolest nerds in the universe, so I hope you'll check them out. Now, you know where you can find me around the rest of the internet, at Some Gadget Guy, basically everywhere, but these days, I'm spending a bit more time on the Mastodons, a little more time on the Blueskis, a lot less so on the Facebooks and the Instagrams, the Threads, definitely not on the Twitters, and I will catch you all on the next review.